statement. So welcome everybody. We are so excited that we already got started. So Nicholas and I are here. My name is Kerry Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the National Constitution Center. And we're here today to talk to you all about the Electoral College. So let me have Nicholas introduce himself, and then we're gonna dive into some big questions around it. So Nicholas, tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive into this.
Yes, well, let's just be quick so we can get right into this. I'm Nicholas Mosvick, and I am one of our senior fellows in constitutional content at the National Constitution Center. And the only thing that's important about me is that I have a PhD in American history and a law degree. So I am a constitutional history expert.
And we are excited to have Nicholas with us today. And what I love to do is always remember, because he has both of those degrees, we like to stump the Nicholas. So if there's questions that you have during the program, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A. Sometimes the chat gets a little chatty, so if you don't like to use that, use the Q&A and I'll be looking for your questions in there as well. Today, and Nicholas, I'm gonna start with all my questions and then we'll jump to the students' questions. So we're gonna talk about the Electoral College. And we have to start with, okay, so what is it? Where is it in the Constitution? And so we want to know all about the history of why we have it in our Constitution, where it lives in the Constitution, but then some of the modern questions around it too. Like, people talk about it all the time, and our students hear it in the news, and their parents are talking about it. Help us understand what's the debate around the Electoral College today. So that's a lot to do, and we're gonna do it in 35 minutes. So you ready? Tell us a little bit more about it, and let's dive into the Constitution.
All right. So what are we starting with, Kerry? So which one?
What the heck is it?
What is the Electoral College? The very basic question. Well, we're talking about the way in which we elect the president. And of course, that sort of answers itself, which is to say, it's not like other countries or democracies in the world. A lot of them follow what we would call direct election, meaning that it's popularly elected. In other words, you count up the number of votes of the populace and that elects the presidency. It's direct, right? That's what we mean by direct. The Electoral College is an institution that was created instead to, in order, and basically, as we'll get into talking about this, because it's hard to say this without getting into the debate a little bit, but yeah. Needless to say, the short of it is, right, the debate was between, should we have Congress or some other body of the government pick the president, or should we have the people? And the Electoral College was the institution created to be the middle ground of sorts, the compromise, right? That was neither, right? It reflected in some ways the will of the people, but it also in some ways reflected sort of not necessarily anti-democratic, but a way of mitigating pure majoritarianism, right?
Got it. So that's a big word, Nick. I like it. Good to expose us to new words. So I'm showing an image right now of the Electoral College. And so you were talking about direct voting. So this is like this image right here, that the people are voting for their representatives in the government directly. And so in our country, the people, not everybody can vote. You have to be of certain age, certain criteria. But for who do we directly vote for in our country? Just to give students a couple examples of direct voting.
Yeah, so originally we only had direct election for the House. So the House of Representatives. So we always remember that Congress, of course, has two institutions, right? The Senate and the House. Senate originally was actually done through the state legislators who would, so obviously the people pick the state legislators, but then the legislators themselves pick the Senate, which was again meant to be an intermediary, right? A way of sort of limiting majority rule, right? But that changed with the 17th Amendment, which was, I believe, in 1913. So that's a relatively recent change in history when you think about it. But that's now the system we have. So direct election for the Senate and for the House. So all of Congress's races are direct. And then the presidency, there's a little bit, there's a little bit of room there, in part because states ultimately still choose the rules for their electoral systems. We've talked about that before under Article 1. That's the time, manner, and place regulations that states are allowed to make on their elections. And that includes some experimentation in terms of how they allocate these electoral votes. So the idea of the Electoral College is you have these people who are called electors. They go and they meet at the Electoral College, and then they cast their votes. Each state has the amount of votes proportional to their population, right? It's the same as the amount of members in the House. Kerry's got a map there, right? So if you're looking at my home state of Minnesota, they have 10 electoral votes. So that's 10 people who get sent to the Electoral College. Under most states, they essentially commit to voting for whoever wins the majority of votes in that state. But that's also where we get into some of the debate, right? Is can they actually change their mind? Are they able to vote their conscience or whoever they want to, since they're ultimately they get to make the vote, even if they've made this promise? And then there's two states that kind of do their own system. Maine is now experimenting, that's the big one, with runoff voting, right? A system where essentially you rank, right? A ranked ballot. So that if your first choice, for instance, isn't amongst the two candidates who are split, right? It goes down to your ranked voting in terms of who you actually allocate your vote to. And as Kerry shows you, Nebraska also has experimented with split electoral votes, right? Which is, you can kind of figure that out by its term, right? It's essentially saying we go by their percentage or we split the amount of votes. Therefore, the state in theory can send 4 people for one and 1 for another person, right? They can split their vote. That way it's allocated like the Maine system. The idea is to make it more a mirror of the preferences of the actual people, as opposed to winner take all, which is the typical thing of states, right? You see that Kerry shows you with California. You win California, you get them all. That's generally been the way the Electoral College works. But as you can see, this is part of the debate about whether or not that ultimately reflects the voter preferences in a state, particularly in California, where you have so many electoral votes that it is the most important domino to fall in the Electoral College.
So that's really, really helpful to understand. Okay, as I move you guys all around and get you seasick, as we look at this graphic, when we vote for somebody in the House or somebody in the Senate, the direct populace is voting. Those who can vote are voting. That vote goes right to that House of Congress. But with the Electoral College, it's a system set up so the people vote for electorate, and those electorate take those votes and go for the president. Each state, each area, Washington, D.C. has a different number, but it's up to the states to decide how they split those numbers. Pennsylvania, as an example, has the number that it has is 18 members of the House. They get 18 electoral votes from the House and 2 from the senators. So you all now have to look and see exactly your number in your state and how it works in your state, because it's the easiest way to understand it is locally. I love the idea that you can be California, winner take all, or you can split it like Nebraska. And that's up to the states to decide. So when we talk about this, there are pieces that are in the Constitution. Now, the part that is up to the states to decide, that's a part of federalism, right, Nick?
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah.
So if you were in last week's class, remember us talking about federalism, and we promised we'd never let it go away. Here's an example of how it's directly seen to play out. So the national government says how a president is elected and who can be president, but then the state gets to decide how those votes are counted, either winner take all or split or ranked choice voting. It's ranked choice voting. Yeah. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, it changed that just this year, actually. It is a new system. Because I think before they were doing a split system, it's now ranked choice. But to answer some of the questions I'm seeing, we're actually talking about the 2 exceptions, because that's all the other 48 states are winner take all.
Got it. So most of them are like California.
Yeah. So we talk about these because there is some movement for reforms or experimentation. I think that means people want to see if Maine works, basically. And this goes to last week, right? We talked about the laboratories of democracy. Well, I mean, I think you see the principle at hand here in terms of people will wait and see, okay, does this split balloting, does this ranked choice, is that actually something we should consider more broadly, or should we continue with the system we've had, right?
And I think that's great, because what, you know, as students and learners, we hear people talking about it all the time, but people tend to talk and speak about this like you already know the backstory. So that's what I want to make sure that everybody kind of knows. What are they debating? What are they talking about? They're talking about the system overall. And, you know, how does this system work and why does it work this way? And then the second question is, what are the role of the states in experimenting with this system? Like you said, 48 states are like California, winner take all. Only a few have the split electoral votes. So Nick, real quick, because Lauren wanted to know, do you know if New York is winner take all or split?
I'm pretty sure, just because, as we said, we're generally pretty much all the states are. We'll get to the movement of states to alter how they deal with the Electoral College. There's the interstate compact to try to better reflect essentially the popular vote, right? To follow the popular vote. Yeah, so we're talking about winner take all. We'll get to kind of what the subtle differences between all these things are. But I think, as Kerry's suggesting, we want to kind of go back to the start, because that's part of what we're doing here. Is all this policy stuff we're talking about very interesting in terms of what states are trying. But in order to answer the policy question, is with every class we do, that's why we go to the Constitution, we go to the history, and we kind of start at the beginning. Before I do that, Kerry, I'll note, thanks for clearing up. I made an error there. I misstated. The electoral votes come as a combination of your House and Senate seats. So it's the total of the seats. I think I misstated that. So it's good to clarify that. That's why you see that map reflect that, right? So that means if you're in one of the smaller states, you have 2 Senate seats. Therefore, the smallest states get 3 electoral votes, right?
Yeah, that's helpful. I'm sorry, Nick, I would have caught that. I totally thought you said that.
No, and I just wanted to be clear, because it's important for everyone to get the right information, right? So don't mistake that. That's how we get to 538 votes, right? 435 in the House, 2 Senate seats for 50 states, and then 3 Electoral College votes for DC, which is the 23rd Amendment, right? So that's how you get to 538.
I wanted to go back to the Constitutional Convention, because some people could be asking right now, how come we just don't vote for it as a popular vote? Why did they put this system into place? And let's walk through it in a little bit more detail. Here's some big questions around it, like how do we elect a president? How long is the term? All those pieces. But why did they do this? Why did they set up this Electoral College in the first place? Because it seems kind of hard, and there's got to be a reason behind it. So can you do a little walk through the American history and tell us, why is it there in the first place? What was the reasoning behind making it more difficult?
Yeah, and I think the important place to start is just to kind of give that basic reminder of, in 1787, what is the experience of executive power that the founders are taking from and debating over how they want to do differently, right? And that's King George, right? That's monarchy, their experience under the British government. What they think of as being tyrannical and the kind of executive power they don't want, right? So that's one version of tyrannical executive power that they're looking at, right? They're looking at not only King George, but European kings generally, right? Other systems of government, how they do and do not work. And they're looking at state constitutions, right? We talk about this all the time, but it's worth remembering, right? Madison is not the only one, but Madison's prominent is someone who learns a lot from the failures of state governments between 1776 and 1787. Here in Pennsylvania, for instance, there's no real elected executive under the 1776 Constitution, right? Some states try essentially executive councils, right? Massachusetts gives a little more power. They have a limited veto power for the presidency, right? So states try different things. And the lesson here generally seems to be, we need a stronger executive. The Articles of Confederation didn't have that, right? They had a president of Congress, but very limited power, right? And so they needed a more powerful executive. They believed that executive needed to be able to check Congress in particular. We'll get into all this with Article 2. But they spent a lot of time debating not only what the executive would look like, but then therefore how they would be voted. My point in bringing up all this is that they tied those things together, right? So to them, the vote, how the president was chosen was really important because they are already worried about creating an executive that was sufficiently powerful, but not so powerful, not so independent that they would be tyrannical, right? This framing, I think, is important because it helps you to see why it is that so many of the founders would have been nervous about direct popular election, right? What have made them nervous because is Elbridge Gerry, our friend from Massachusetts, one of the 3 dissenters, suggested during the Constitutional Convention is, look, I mean, if the president gets to rely on the people too much, they have too direct a relationship, it will be charlatans and who get elected president, right? The people will be deceived and we'll end up with tyrannical rulers who look more like the kings of Europe than they do democratic executives that we want, right? So that's the background, right? What is the framing of this debate? So as I suggested at the beginning, right, you kind of have 3 relative positions. You have those who would prefer completely indirect election. By that I mean Congress choosing. Some suggestions, like Gary suggested, state governors or even state legislators could choose. Who preferred Congress picking the president? Well, the southern states did. One reason for that is that we've talked about the 3/5 compromise before. We'll talk about it again. But they are already concerned that slaves would count for representation. But one more way to ensure greater control over the government, even if they were a minority of the population, was also to give them more of a role in selecting the president. Who wanted direct election of the president? Well, some of the strongest Federalists, as we talked about in the ratification debate in the Constitutional Convention, the Federalists were those who were pro-strong national government, right? And some of them wanted direct popular election. One of those most prominently was James Wilson, who favored direct popular election. So did Gouverneur Morris. Wilson continued to push for it. But then there was the middle position, right? As we talked about, the sort of compromise, figuring out, okay, what's the in-between if neither of these options are acceptable? Because this is one of the issues that went down to the wire, so to speak, in September of 1787 at the end of the Constitutional Convention, right? You see here, I mentioned Gouverneur Morris. He is actually kind of a little complicated, right? Because he also is worried about, as I suggested, the presidency being too close to the people. This has to do with not only the election of the president, but the power he has, right? The problem is, if the result would be that he'd be the work of intrigue, of cabal and faction, it would produce a president who's the mere tool of Congress. So Kerry's showing you this because this was Morris responding to those who wanted the Congress to pick it, is to say, okay, so you're worried about the people having too much control and electing a fool to be president, but what about Congress, right? We're talking about the problem of aristocracy. What looks more aristocratic than letting Congress control the presidency, right? So this, again, if you understand the context of this debate, is how we get to why does the Electoral College start to sound more and more like the best solution to this problem? Kerry, I don't know if you want to bring any questions and take a pause.
Just a side note, I always find it shocking that Gouverneur Morris, because he was a bit of an elite snob, so the fact that he has this argument always makes me laugh. But it's this balance between, the popular vote and then allowing others to pick it, and they're trying to come somewhere in between and say, we have to have a happy medium, because they're really, really worried about this idea of factions and mob rule. They get super worried about that. So they're trying to put in systems to slow things down and give checks within the system of electing president. And I think that's really important to know. But and we'll get into this, Nick, when we get to why do we still have it today? How does this also in a way, balance the majority and the minority understanding. Like, if only a small group of people want one thing, is their voice being heard? And I know we're going to jump into a lot of different people during this conversation, and we have a lot to get through. But how did they settle like on the electoral compromise, and what is it that Wilson said about it? Because he was kind of the guy in between as well. He believed in, popular vote, but then also understood the balance between the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question because it also points out one of the reasons I think for interest in an electoral college, if you're a smaller state, is because it secures some voice for you in the national affairs, the same way you decided to be equal representation in the first place, right? Is, well, you don't want a popular vote if you're from Connecticut, right? Because then you fear your voice will be completely trampled out. You already fear that, right? So that doesn't sound great to you. Neither does congressional election necessarily either, right? Because now you're also looking at a related problem, right? So that also points out, as we talked about with the Constitutional Convention ratification, reminding ourselves of the very interest in 1787, right? The competing interests, or as Kerry suggested, factions, right? Who are thinking about this, right? So we've already been talking about how we get there, right? Initially, James, I didn't even mention James Madison and his Virginia plan. That's important. Madison also suggested election by Congress. Why this compromise ultimately? As I suggested, right, I think it's because for Wilson, it was ultimately the best possible solution, right? As he put it, I was finding this quote, right? He says, quote, "The choice of the president is brought as nearly home to the people as is practical. With the approbation of the state legislator, the people may elect with only one remove," right? Now that sounds a little bit cumbersome, but to simplify it, his point here was, look, I realized we weren't going to get direct popular election. I talked about it. I asked for it multiple times. I argued for it. This institution allowed us to have one step removed from that, right? His idea being was like, look, the people elect their state legislators, right? They have a voice. This is just one more step removed, but those representatives are going to mirror their intentions and properly represent them, and therefore will be closer to the people's desires anyways than we would be if we had congressional election, right? That's the way Wilson is thinking is, look, this may look like just a compromise, but to me, it's a little bit closer to my side than it is to the other side. And so actually it's a pretty good solution. And, I am happy that I got it, right? This is way better than the alternative, right?
And I think that's a really important thing to like spell out to people, that they were looking at multiple plans. And that this is getting closer and closer to like marrying them together. And I love James Wilson. So it's interesting that he was like, look, I'm behind it. Now, here's, I guess, the next question for you. So that was the idea, that they wanted these electorate to be able to be representative, listen to the people's vote, and then vote in the way that they wanted to. And we're going to get to that final question at the end, is like, do they have to? And can they be punished if they don't? If they choose to go rogue, are they allowed to? And we're going to get to that question at the end, guys. So think about what you guys think about it. But there's a lot of history in between Wilson and today. And what I always wonder, and I'm going to put it in the chat box too, here's my question is, has the Electoral College actually worked over time? Has it worked the way they thought it would? Or has it been tested? And how has it been tested?
Yeah, and while they're thinking about that, I'll just note in relation to what we're talking about here at the convention, right? Part of this argument is, okay, so we have these electors. Are they supposed to represent just the will of the people? Or are they supposed to be these virtuous, disinterested people who can truly represent the greater will? In other words, right, not just particular interests, but the best things for the country, right? So it's kind of the Madisonian proposition versus the Wilsonian proposition, if you will, right? So even that is actually part of the question, right? They have this compromise, but then exactly what is expected out of the Electoral College, that itself is an interesting question, right? And that's one that I think in many ways we continue to argue over too.
So question for you, and that's a really, really good point. So do they do what the people have asked them to do, or do they do what they believe is the right thing to do for the good of all? And that's the debate. It's always that debate. So I want to jump really quickly because we have about 10 minutes left. I want to spend 5 minutes looking at some elections that tested this. So they didn't get too far, and already the Electoral College, the way they had set it up, is tested. So do you want to start talking about the election of 1796?
Yeah, I think we'll kind of speed through that because we want to get to election 1800, because that's the big one. The election 1796 is a problem because, simply put, they didn't think about the possibility that the president and vice president would be political enemies. That the way that they had set up the ballot in the Electoral College, it would allow for this possibility, because at that time it's just, well, the runner-up in the Electoral College becomes the vice president. Well, you can see how that became a problem. Jefferson was close to Adams in that particular race to follow up George Washington after he retired. And it was a bitter contest. Bitter not just between the two men who were once friends and then later friends again, but between the emerging political parties of the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. And by the election of 1800, it had grown that much worse. So I used to show students a mock campaign video of the election 1800 using newspaper columns from the respective sides about the accusations made of each other, that John Adams was a hermaphroditic character, and that Thomas Jefferson would basically he would be the end of Western civilization. That this was apocalyptic, right? This contest was as bad as it could be. And this is, think about it, count the elections at this point. This is the fourth election in the history of the country, and it is completely rancorous, right? Just the level of argument that is going on. And of course, it's a close contest again. The problem here isn't that the president and vice president are the ones who are together. The problem here is that Burr and Jefferson, who are really the first campaign ticket, right? This is the first time we have what we think about as a ticket in which people of the same party, which, as I said, are emerging at this time, run together. Well, what is the problem? Well, the electors go in and they vote for both of them. And we end up with a tie. So Jefferson and his running mate, or who he thinks is his running mate, tie. Burr initially says, you know what, I'll let you have it, but then he changes his mind and says, I'll wait for the will of the people. What he means is, hey, if they choose me, if I win, our agreement to be the running mate, don't worry about that. So now it goes to the House, right? The House actually, under the Constitution, they now decide, right? And we didn't get to these particular provisions, but the point is it goes to the House. And there are 36 ballots that are cast because they cannot come up with a result that actually awards enough electoral votes to one candidate or the other. Kerry showing you Hamilton here. At this point, Hamilton actually has no position in the federal government. Adams had kicked him out of the cabinet 2 years earlier for a variety of reasons. He didn't really trust Hamilton anymore. But Hamilton still has allies. He knows a lot of people. Hamilton also knows Burr and does not trust him. He doesn't like Jefferson very much. They haven't liked each other since they were in Washington's cabinet. Everyone who knows the play probably knows this.
I was gonna say there's a Hamilton reference coming up. We have to make it.
Probably know this, but in any case, Hamilton essentially says, look, Jefferson, I don't love him, but he has character. Burr does not. Therefore, we should support Jefferson. We need to find a way to get him to be president. Burr cannot be president. Ultimately, it's a man named James Bayard, who is who's in Congress. I think he's a Delaware representative. But in any case, he has some sway over other votes. Ultimately, what he does is he doesn't actually vote for anyone on a ballot, but enough other people swing too. that Jefferson narrowly wins. Bayard supposedly believes that there's a deal in the works to help preserve some Federalist positions, but in any case, a deal is made. Jefferson becomes president. But you see how close this was to disaster. In fact, word was out that there was militias, both on the Federalist and Republican side, that were getting ready to march on Washington, which had just been built. The capital city was new at this point. And supposedly civil war was a possibility, right? So that's how bad it was before there was a transfer of power. And Adams himself left the White House before Jefferson could even arrive. So this was a bitter contest, and in part because they didn't know what to do in the case of what happened, right? A tie.
So I love this election because, first of all, it sounds like we're listening to a soap opera. It's so much intrigue, so much drama. It changes the Constitution, what happens after it.
Yep.
But also, if we ever think that modern presidential elections are really stressful, we can look back at this one and say, look how crazy it was then, and say like this, and there was still, this peaceful transition of power. And I remember reading a letter about how Adams rides quietly on Sunset out of the capital city on his horse and is like nodding to like, okay, Jefferson, it's all you. They wound up being really good friends in the end. And they
12
both
years.
12, yeah. They both died on the same day, which is 4th of July. But
hours apart.
Quickly our country sees that the Electoral College isn't working right the way they have it set up. So they quickly change it and they add a 12th Amendment. And we have 2 minutes to go through this because then I want to get to the modern question around this. We talked about the system. We talked about it, how it was developed, how it was instantly tested, how it changed the Constitution. And now we want to go back to those electors, because that's the question. What is their job today? So real quick, 12th Amendment.
Yeah, I mean, let's just sum it up quickly. Obviously, is suggested this is passed as a result of the election of 1800. Everyone agrees this really can't happen again. So what does it do? It makes it so there are 2 separate ballots. That's the problem, right? There wasn't a separate ballot. You just put your votes, and therefore a tie was possible. What's the solution? Well, now under the 12th Amendment, electors in the future would cast 2 votes, but one would be for the president and the other for the vice president. So you see, right, there are separate votes now. That's the simple solution, right? It establishes some other rules that are important. It makes it so that the House, in the event that there was no Electoral College majority, would choose a president from the top 3, not the top 5 electoral vote getters, and that the Senate would choose a vice president from the top 2 electoral vote getters, right? So it does actually set out a bunch more rules that are actually important for presidential conscience. But the point is, like, they've learned from the election of 1800. It actually only takes another 20 years after that to test this. The election of 1824 does go to the House again. The top 3 vote getters, that actually has the effect that Henry Clay, who came fourth, he's Speaker of the House. He essentially gets to make the deal. He gets to choose who, more or less, who gets to be president. He chooses John Quincy Adams, who was actually second in electoral votes, and he becomes Secretary of State, what's known as the corrupt bargain. So that actually happens relatively quickly. Now, this is that hypothetical question we're getting to. Can a state punish an electoral college elector when she casts her vote for a presidential candidate that differs from the one who actually won the popular vote, right?
Well, so don't answer it yet. We're going to let them answer it in the chat, but I just want to make sure we all know who we're talking about. So let's look at this picture. So this is, me. I'm in this group. I'm going to vote for somebody, and then that tells my designated elector who to vote for me. So they are then told. Then they go to a meeting, and they vote for the president. So the question is, can a state punish electoral college elector when she cast her vote for a president that differs from the one that was actually with the popular vote? It's a shorter way to say it. So if this person here decides to say, I'm not listening to the people in Pennsylvania and vote differently, can they be punished? And so we've got a yes, we've got a no. Remember, it's not, it's the question really is not should they or should they not, it's can they, are they allowed to?
Yes.
And it's really, can they be punished? Because it's up to them with their own mental state will cast that vote.
Yeah.
I
And
think
remember, the punishment might just be a fine, a small fine.
Yeah. So the answer, Nick, is if they do not follow it, can they be punished?
Yes.
Yes. And so this
from,
came down. Could you tell us the court case and how this came down recently?
Yeah, so this is actually from last term. So this was just decided actually in the summer, given that the Supreme Court term was a little bit unusual this year. I don't know that we need to know the particular case name. I think the point is what this is known now as the faithless electors case. Faithless electors just mean they're, as I suggested, they promised to follow the vote, right? It's usually parties who actually choose these electors. So they're signing a pledge that says, I'm going to cast my vote according to these instructions. If they show up and go vote for somebody else, which happened in 2016, there was a handful of so-called faithless electors, and they were punished. I think the fines were like $1,000, maybe $400, something like that. So they were just fines, right? But the point is, the Supreme Court said, look, states can do this. It goes back to a 1952 case called Gray versus Blair. What's interesting about that, just in a quick way, is that Justice Robert Jackson, he dissents and he says, look, if you look at the Constitutional Convention in the history, electors were supposed to be what he calls free agents. They were supposed to be able to pick according to their conscience, right? And do what was best for the country. But the Supreme Court, the majority says, no, states make their rules under Article 1, right? We've talked about this power before. And therefore, they get to choose if they want to punish those who do not follow the rules that they've created for electors.
So I got a question for you, and then we'll wrap up because we're almost out of time. So they can still vote the way they want, but they'll be punished for it. I guess the next question is, if you're saying that they should vote for the way you want them, why have that step in between?
So can you restate that?
So why
have the Electoral College?
Yeah, like, no, not the Electoral College. That, I mean, there's pros and cons of the Electoral College, and that I understand. I guess the question is, why not then say, okay, all of these votes get into this, and there's no second step. You'd have to change the Constitution, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just to clarify, they can still technically vote for whatever they deem is, because you can't control them,
Yes.
but they can be fined for it. So that is a really kind of good way to wrap it up and say, this is the system we have. It gives weight to the states in a way to make sure smaller states and larger states are both heard, but how it is played out is up to the states. And then what is the role of the electors in this system as well? So there's a lot to unpack there. And that was really fun to run through in a very quick time period. If you guys have more questions, please put them into the Q&A. We will circle back on this topic today at 2, Wednesday at 12 and 2. And I wanted to thank you, Nicholas, for a really fun way to walk through one of my favorite elections and one of the most interesting stories.
We spent all the time on that, but the election of 1800 is always worth spending time on.
It is. And it is one that will pop up over and over again in class, in studies, and your knowledge. So that's why we like to make sure you get it strong and right. So thank you all very much.
Yep.
Thank you, Milo.